8 years as Florida's Attorney General. 8 years of press conferences, courtrooms, legislative battles, and the kind of media presence that turns a state-level official into a national brand. Bondi didn't just do the job, she performed it. And there's nothing dismissive about using that word, because performance is a legitimate and necessary skill in American politics. Knowing when to be sharp and when to be smooth. Knowing when to lean into a camera and when to let silence do the work. Knowing how to walk into a hostile space and make it feel like you own it before you've said a single word. She carried all of that into conservative media, into high-profile political defenses, into the inner circles of the MAGA coalition. She became someone whose name alone signaled a certain kind of competence. Formidable. Polished. Prepared. The kind of person you put on television when you need someone who won't flinch. And then there's what nobody warned her about. The difference between someone who has learned not to flinch and someone who has never had a reason to. Jasmine Crockett didn't learn how to fight in Washington. She came to Washington already knowing how. Before the congressional seat, before the national profile, before her face was on anyone's television screen, she was in courtrooms. Real ones. Not the theatrical version of legal combat that plays out during congressional hearings where the questions are timed to 5 minutes and the answers are press releases in disguise. Actual courtrooms, with actual stakes, with clients whose freedom and futures depended entirely on how prepared their attorney was when it counted most. Criminal defense. Civil rights litigation. Years of standing in rooms where the other side had more resources, more institutional weight, more structural advantage, and finding a way to win anyway. Not through volume, not through performance, through preparation so thorough that by the time you stand up, you've already had the argument 3 times in your own head, anticipated every counterpoint, and built a structure that holds even when the other side pushes back hard. That kind of training does something to a person that no amount of media coaching can replicate. It teaches you that confidence is only as valuable as the substance behind it. It teaches you that the person who walks into the room looking most certain is sometimes the person most likely to be caught off guard. And it teaches you, most critically, that the moment your opponent stops arguing the facts and starts attacking you personally, you haven't lost the exchange. You've won it. Because that shift from substance to personal attack is a white flag dressed up as aggression. Crockett knew this. She'd seen it 100 times in courtrooms. She knew exactly what it meant. And she was waiting for it. The hearing itself was the kind that Washington produces when the tension between oversight and executive power reaches a boiling point. The kind that gets scheduled not just to ask questions, but to make records, because the real audience isn't always the people in the room. It's the historical document that gets assembled from the transcript afterward. The official testimony that can be cited and cross-referenced and revisited long after the news cycle has moved on. Bondi walked in the way she always does. Measured. Controlled. The body language of someone who has been in enough of these rooms to know the rhythm of them. When to expand and when to deflect. When to answer fully and when to answer adjacent to the question without technically evading it. She is genuinely skilled at this. The early portion of the hearing reflected that skill. She handled the opening volleys with the ease of a veteran, moving through questions with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared her answers before anyone in the room had finished preparing their questions. And across from her, Jasmine Crockett was watching. Not just listening, watching. Reading the patterns. Identifying the strategy. Taking note of which questions made Bondi lean forward and which ones made her lean back. Noticing where the precision in her answers narrowed and where it deliberately blurred. Filing all of it away. Because Crockett wasn't there to score debate points. She was there to build a case. When Crockett's turn came, she didn't open with a broadside. She opened with a question. One single, specific, carefully crafted question. The kind that looks simple on the surface and is anything but. Any experienced trial attorney will tell you there's a category of question that isn't really a question at all. It's a foundation stone. You're not asking because you don't know the answer. You're asking because you need the other person to put their answer on the record before you show them where it leads. Prosecutors use this technique. Defense attorneys use it. The best ones make it look like conversation. Bondi answered. Confidently. Completely. with the full assurance of someone who believed they were handling the exchange with the same ease they'd handled everything else that morning. That answer was exactly what Crockett needed. She moved to the second question. Then a third. Each one landing naturally, each one feeling like the logical next step in a reasonable line of inquiry, each one quietly assembling something that Bondi hadn't yet recognized she was helping to build. The room was still operating at its normal temperature. People were paying attention, but nothing had crested yet. And then Crockett stopped asking questions and started presenting conclusions. What happened next is the part that made the clips travel. Crockett laid out, methodically, calmly, without a single raised syllable, exactly what Bondi had just said in this hearing room and placed it directly next to what Bondi had publicly said in other settings. Not paraphrased, not interpreted, documented, sourced. The actual language from actual statements, from legal filings, from media appearances where Bondi had taken positions with confidence and camera-ready conviction. And the contradiction was not subtle. This is the move that separates legal cross-examination from political theater. In political theater, you make accusations. You invoke implications. You use language that sounds devastating but can be walked back or reframed because it was never precise enough to pin down. In actual cross-examination, you don't accuse. You demonstrate. You let the record speak because the record cannot be spun. It simply exists. And once it exists on camera, in a congressional hearing, in an official transcript, it lives there permanently. Bondi found herself looking at her own words. Not an interpretation of her words, not someone's unfair characterization of her position. Her actual words, arranged in a sequence that made the contradiction undeniable. She pushed back, which was the only available move. You don't sit there in silence, you push back, you reframe, you work to find language that softens the edges of what just happened. She was forceful about it. You could hear the recalibration happening in real time, the mental pivot from confident offense to defensive recovery, the attempt to assert that what Crockett was presenting wasn't actually what it appeared to be. Crockett had expected every word of it. She responded without hesitation. Not because she's naturally unflappable, but because she had already prepared for this exact response, and the 3 other responses Bondi might have given instead. She addressed the pushback point by point, and she added another layer of documentation as she did it, which meant that Bondi's attempt to reframe the situation had now become part of the official record too. It was the kind of judo move that only works when you've studied the opponent carefully enough to know where they'll move before they move there. And then came the mistake. The moment that changed the temperature of the entire room. Bondi, feeling the ground shift in a way she clearly hadn't anticipated, did what people do when they've run out of substantive runway. She got personal. It wasn't a screaming accusation. It didn't need to be. It was the particular kind of dismissiveness that political veterans use when they want to delegitimize a challenge without engaging the substance of it. A suggestion that Crockett's standing to raise these questions was questionable. An implication that the whole inquiry was politically motivated rather than factually grounded. The tone of someone trying to remind the room of a hierarchy that, in her estimation, should have been making this whole exchange easier to control. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the sharpened attention quiet of people watching something unfold. The held breath quiet of people who have just watched someone step over a line and are waiting to see what happens next. Jasmine Crockett looked at Pam Bondi. And the thing about that look, the thing that everyone in that room noticed before she said a single word, was what was absent from it. There was no flash of anger, no wounded pride, no scrambling recalibration. What was there instead was something far more unnerving for the person on the receiving end of it, the calm recognition of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, because exactly this was the proof she needed. What she said in response wasn't a speech, it wasn't a rally moment. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets set to dramatic music and turned into a campaign ad. It was better than that. It was a dismantling. She addressed the substance of Bondi's attempt at dismissal, not to defend herself, because she didn't need to defend herself, but to name precisely what had just happened and why it mattered. She talked about the pattern of what occurs in these rooms when powerful people realize the questions being asked are questions they cannot comfortably answer. She talked about what it reveals when the response to scrutiny is an attack on the person doing the scrutinizing. She talked about accountability, what it requires of the people demanding it, and what it exposes in the people trying to avoid it. She kept her voice level throughout. She didn't reach for dramatic effect. She didn't slow down for emphasis in the places where emphasis would feel performed. She just spoke, clearly and directly, in the voice of someone delivering a professional assessment to a room full of professionals. And it was far more devastating than volume ever could have been. The seconds after she finished are the seconds that everyone who was in that room carries with them. Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi, who has stood in front of cameras for 20-plus years and never once looked like she didn't know what she was doing. Looked like she didn't know what she was doing. Not dramatically. Not in a way that requires any exaggeration to communicate. Just visibly, quietly, undeniably rattled. The composure was gone. The assurance was gone. The expression that had settled on her face was one that political professionals recognize immediately. It is the expression of someone who made a move they cannot unmake and who is now living in the first seconds of understanding what that means. Members of the committee reacted. Democratic members with quiet acknowledgement. Republican members with the specific stillness that overtakes people who are calculating whether to intervene and concluding that intervention would only attach their name to a moment they'd rather not be associated with. Even the press gallery, reporters who are paid to maintain professional neutrality and who have seen more staged dramatic moments than they can count, were exchanging glances that didn't require translation. Bondi attempted to respond. Technically, she did respond, but the words didn't have weight behind them, and a room full of people who have spent their careers listening to arguments knows the difference between a person making a case and a person filling time. The edge was gone. The precision was gone. She was running out the clock on a turn she wished had ended 60 seconds earlier. Crockett let her finish. Didn't interrupt. Didn't pile on. Didn't do anything to extend the moment or extract additional footage from it. She simply let Bondi's words settle into the room, and then she moved on. Next question. Same calm. Same focus. As if the previous 2 minutes had been simply another item on a checklist. Completed. Documented. Set aside. That restraint is worth sitting with for a moment. Because the easiest thing, the most human thing, would have been to press the advantage. To make the room feel how completely the exchange had gone. To let the moment breathe a little longer in her favor. And she didn't do it. She moved forward. Which told you more about who Jasmine Crockett is than anything she said in the actual exchange, because it communicated that she wasn't there for the performance of accountability. She was there for the practice of it. Outside the hearing room, the clip started moving before the session had even ended. Staffers watching on feeds. Political observers who follow these hearings the way sports fans follow game film. The footage spread with the particular velocity that only unscripted moments generate, because audiences have become extraordinarily sophisticated at identifying the difference between planned confrontations and actual ones. The planned ones get ignored. The actual ones travel at a speed that no communication strategy can keep up with. By evening, it had been seen by millions. By the following morning, it was the thing everyone was talking about across the political spectrum, though notably, the conversation on the two sides sounded very different. On one side, genuine enthusiasm for what had played out. On the other side, something more like deliberate silence. Not defense, not spin, just the quiet of people who looked at what happened and understood that there was no useful way to characterize it other than what it was. Bondi's team ran the standard post-game protocol, statements emphasizing her substantive points from earlier in the hearing. Efforts to redirect attention toward the portions of her testimony that had gone more favorably. The tools that communications professionals reach for after a difficult public moment. These tools work under certain conditions. They don't work when the moment is too widely witnessed and too clearly legible to require interpretation. The clip was already everywhere. People had already seen her face in those seconds. No statement could rewrite what cameras had recorded. Crockett, for her part, kept the focus exactly where she'd had it throughout, on the substance. The contradictions in the record she had surfaced. the accountability questions that remained unanswered, the documentation she had entered into the official transcript. She didn't discuss the personal moment. She didn't reference Bondi's visible discomfort. She talked about the work, because for her, that is what it is. Work. Professional, serious, consequential work that doesn't require a victory lap to be meaningful. The larger significance of this moment, though, is what it reveals about something shifting in these institutions. For a long time, a very long time, the formula for surviving a congressional hearing as a senior official was essentially, bring your resume into the room with you. Project authority. Answer with the fluency of experience. Use your standing to control the temperature of any exchange that gets uncomfortable, and trust that the person across from you, however well-intentioned, however passionate, however well-prepared they believe themselves to be, would eventually encounter the limit of their ability to penetrate the wall that authority and institutional gravitas can construct. That formula worked because it was based on an accurate reading of the dynamics in those rooms for most of American political history. What Pam Bondi encountered is the leading edge of why it's starting to fail. Because the people asking questions now are increasingly people who haven't just studied the subject. They've lived it. They've tried cases in real courts under real pressure with real consequences. They've developed the specific skill set, preparation, composure, anticipation, and the ability to build a structure of argument that holds even when it gets pushed hard, that makes the authority as shield strategy not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. Because when authority is deployed against someone who isn't impressed by it and can demonstrate why it shouldn't substitute for substance, the deployment of that authority doesn't protect you. It becomes evidence. It becomes exactly the illustration of the pattern you were trying to avoid confirming. It goes into the record. It goes into the clip. It goes into the millions of views that follow. That is what Pam Bondi will carry from this hearing. Not the substance of her testimony, not the arguments she prepared, but the 3 or 4 seconds after she made the move she shouldn't have made, and the face she couldn't control in the aftermath of it. Washington will produce more moments like this one, probably soon, because the collision between established institutional authority and genuinely prepared challenge is happening now across more rooms in more settings than at any previous point in recent political memory. What this hearing gave us was a specific, vivid, fully documented example of what that collision looks like when it lands, when the preparation is real, when the substance is airtight, and when the person doing the challenging has spent enough time in genuinely high-stakes rooms to be completely unbothered by the pressure of a congressional hearing. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She demonstrated something about what competence looks like when it's earned rather than projected, and about what accountability looks like when the person demanding it actually knows what they're doing. And Pam Bondi, in those seconds of visible, undeniable rattlement, demonstrated something too. She demonstrated what it looks like when the strategy you've always relied on meets the specific person it was never going to work on, and the realization arrives too late to change anything about what's already been put on the record. That record exists now. It's permanent. It's documented. And it is going to be a part of both of their stories for a very long time. If you made it to the end of this, you already know this is the kind of content that belongs on your feed. Hit the like button. It costs you 1 second, and it matters more than you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications. Because we are not done. And the next story is already built and ready. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't get told the way it should anywhere else. We'll see you there.